working group reports at the same time. And when he was doing that, he actually worked on 4 chapters. So he's a lead author on 4 different chapters of the report, which means, I think, that he got to travel much more than anybody should be expected to travel in a very short period of time. He spent much more of his time writing than he probably should have. So he's been involved in the TAR in the 4 different chapters, and in the AR4, he was involved in Working Group 2 as a CLA, and then also in the SPM, and then on the synthesis report. And Gary is a Woodhouse Sysco professor of economics at Wesleyan University, which is in Middletown, Connecticut. And he's the director of the John Andrus Public Affairs Center. He holds a PhD from Yale, and he studies the economics of climate change. That's what it's your talk.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for showing up, especially since you found out that the food wasn't here yet. Last day, that's pretty impressive. Yeah, I did do my graduate work at Yale. I did my undergraduate work at Penn. I had some friends who were up here at Princeton, some graduate school, some not. So I spent a lot of time up here playing on the golf course over at the bottom of the hill from where the graduate students lived. And it's a pleasure to be back. Sort of wandered around. It's a little bit different, but thank you all for coming and inviting me. I'm here to talk a little bit about some lessons from the last round of climate wars through the IPCC. I heard some chuckling when my roles in the TAR and the AR4 were being recounted. My wife was questioning my sanity many times. She's also pretty sure that I need vocational counseling. We've been working on this problem for 25 years and nothing has happened. We'll move on from that. But I've heard who all has come, and to give some talks, what I thought I might do is give a little bit of a Working Group 2 perspective. A lot of you have Working Group 1 sort of credentials and backgrounds, and GFDL certainly contributes to what goes on there. Ron will tell you that the perspectives of the world and what should be done is a little bit different between Working Group 1 and Working Group 2, and I'll try to highlight some of those and own up to some of our shortcomings and suggest some of the needs that might be required. So as we sort of go through some of the major lessons from the 4th assessment report, they will be sort of a Working Group 2 perspective on what we think we learned and what we think were really important. And I know that for a fact because I stole the slides from Mark Perry. And so he created them, and a lot of those are his talk, which is why my slides have WMO and UNEP on the bottom. And towards the end, I'm going to try to talk a little bit about where the IPCC might be going and how to face off against a tension that I see in the demands on the information from those assessments. So the outline is as follows. I'll review a few of the major lessons. Most of you will know most of them, but then I'm going to try to link those to these tensions. Those are sort of identifying research and information gaps, different views of what those gaps and the relative importance of those gaps might be between working groups, and then sort of a timing thing, and sort of who's the client of all of this stuff. The negotiators who have decided that they want to come to some sort of agreement in Copenhagen within 14 or 18 months, or the scientific community or the assessment community in maintaining the integrity of that particular process. And fundamentally, so as not to bury the lead, what I'm going to try to do is suggest how we might integrate in the jargon from Working Group 2 assessments and special reports into a process that's designed to more quickly and more appropriately inform plenary approved outlines and the context within which the 5th assessment report will actually come forward. A number of us felt we were struggling in the 4th assessment report with plenary approved outlines that we may be informed by what we learned in the second assessment reporting, but pretty much completely missed what we learned in the third assessment report. And that made it very difficult. So the third assessment report, just for reference, wasn't sure if Michael Oppenheimer was going to be here, but earning members are something to talk about. On the left-hand side here are sort of the old SRES temperature trajectories that were available for the third assessment report, the A1, A2, B1, B2, of the various manifestations reflected the temperature, and you see the temperature range of 100. The reasons for concern were negotiated with a great deal of expenditure of time to try to collect some metrics within which we could portray reasons for concern that might be calibrated against changes in global mean temperature beyond maybe even the economic frame. So 5 were determined: unique threat systems, extreme climate events, distributional impacts, aggregate impacts, those are both economic, and then risks of large-scale discontinuities. And then sort of the negotiations about where the literature told us that we should go from modest concern over impacts to an increasing level of concern to a serious level of concern, going from light to yellow, orange to red, depended on sort of which metric that we were talking about. This is actually a graphic that did show up in the third assessment report, chapter 19, did make it through the summary for policymakers, so it was approved by governments. Here's a working group 1 conclusion. I hope it's familiar, and it is where even Martin starts the story, and here's the, sort of the graphic evidence of that. Susan Solomon was always very proud of this graphic, sort of indicating the sort of statistical separation of the anthropogenic and natural signal at the continental level. And then as we begin to work into working group 2 sort of things, impacts that the human beings on the planet would find more interesting than perhaps just raw temperature data, spring budburst dates, forest areas burned, relative sea level rise, starting to get into the level of impacts that influence human beings. This is a portrait of observed effects that were reported in the fourth assessment report for North America. The context for the discussions these days include observations that emissions are accelerating, and carbon dioxide is the largest contributor, but not the only contributor. So that you can wander through those. The bar graphs started in the 70s and end up in 2004. The trend is pretty unequivocal. Take a look at some of the suggestions relative to the various development storylines of the SRES scenarios. Get the idea that unabated, by the way, there's an awful lot of sort of abatement and mitigation built into the storylines, but even with that, emissions of these gases are expected to go up regardless of what story you tell that the future is going to unfold. So, the summary lessons from the fourth assessment report, to my mind, the anthropogenic signals have been confirmed. It's unequivocal. It's been confirmed for observed impacts and attributed to anthropogenic sources. That's a much stronger conclusion than the third assessment report. It seems to us that impacts are happening faster, that thresholds of things that we worry about are moving closer in the future, and the temperature thresholds are now thought to be lower than anticipated just 5 years ago, and those are sort of calibrated in an updated version of the reasons for concern for members that didn't make it into the more lessons that lead me towards where I think we should be going. 2 observations that are actually also found in the Stern review. Any concentration threshold cannot guarantee a specific temperature threshold. The best you can do is talk about various concentration targets, adjusting the relative likelihoods of specific thresholds that you might find important. That is news for working group 2 types. Really, up until that became such a clear conclusion, sort of thought that you could say, okay, well, give me a temperature threshold. I can convert that, talking to my working group 3 guys, to a concentration threshold. And I can be pretty sure I'm going to say it's at 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees or 3 degrees or whatever. Now that's pretty much not true and suggests that this is a risk management problem. To the economists among us, it's beginning to sound like cost-benefit isn't exactly the right approach, that a risk management approach would be more useful. Another strong conclusion from the 3rd assessment report that was amplified in the 4th is vulnerability to climate risk. Now I'm beginning to think about factors in terms of risk. It's amplified in areas that already confront multiple stresses from other things, like degradation, globalization, exposure to disease, poverty, such things as that. And here's a map, actually, that I'm really quite proud of, and if I'm allowed a 3-minute digression. I teach in economics of climate change with first-year students at Wesleyan who come in with no presumed prerequisites. And the first time I taught it was the 19 students. It was just an exceptional group of students. And it was in the middle of the 4th assessment report process. So in the middle of that class, I decided that I would break the rules and give them drafts of regional chapters and ask them in groups to sort of summarize the content and come forward and present some stuff. And a woman named Gianna Palmer, who was a first-year student, 18 years old, out of Oregon, was part of the group that had the Africa chapter, and she read 8 or 9 pages of fairly dense text. I think that's fair to say that the IPCC test is a text that's dense. A couple of tables, and what she thought is that she had had some practice in high school making maps, so she would take the text and locate various manifestations of climate change on a map of Africa. And by virtue of different sizes, try to indicate the relative intensity or confidence in the conclusions, different colors meant different sorts of things. So she did, and there's her map. The observation that comes out of that is that climate change itself is a manifestation, because it has very different manifestations, is itself a source of multiple stresses, and that these things tend to pile up, at least in Africa, on the southeastern coast of Africa. It was one of those, yeah, that makes some sense, but I had never seen it. I took it to a CLA meeting in London, showed it around to all of my 40 other colleagues for the 20 other chapters, and have you ever seen anything like this? And they hadn't. So Gianna is a contributing author to Chapter 20 as an 18-year-old first-year undergraduate student at Wesleyan University, and her father thinks I can walk on water. Okay, so that is an aside. One of the sources of progress, I think, was the enormous amount of work that the people in Chapter 19 did, because they were assigned the task of beginning to inform the results of the IPCC assessment, and therefore the countries and the negotiators, what was meant by dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And the countries weren't willing, when they crafted the plenary group outline, to ask the science communities to answer the question, what is dangerous? So they changed the words and said, what is a key vulnerability? And Steve Schneider, Michael Oppenheimer, and Joel Smith, and those guys said, well, that's a tough one. What do we do with this? It turns out that there's a literature that sort of identifies criteria by which you can assess what might be key. So they assessed that literature and went through and thought about those criteria and didn't quite have the time to ask all of the authors to do this, but to the extent that they could, looked at potential key vulnerabilities and thought that this might be a reasonable lens by which we could assess and direct scientific investigation for the greatest payoff. It also was very supportive of the notion that risk, and a key risk, and a vulnerability associated with that risk, can be calibrated in terms of probability times consequence, and that it was perfectly possible that risk and vulnerability might go up, even if the natural scientific community couldn't tell us any greater influence, any greater confidence about the relative likelihoods of certain things. If the social scientific community could tell us that the consequences were now larger than we thought that they were. So that would become a theme that I think we'll come back to. The IPCC put that forward. Plenary photosynthesis report accepted that, so the negotiators are now stuck start with the concept of risk and the notion that it's probability times consequence. So here are the 7 criteria that Chapter 19 came up with that would identify key vulnerabilities and key risks, the magnitude of the effect, the timing, persistence, or the degree to which it's irreversible, potential for adaptation for the affected system, the distributional impacts, is it sort of tightly distributed or widely distributed, and the relative likelihood, what can we say about that. The 7th was importance. The thought was that to answer whether or not it was important was a policy prescriptive question, and we couldn't do that. So they only worried about 6 and let the negotiators think about what might or might not be important. So for a couple of things, these are some slides that we put together to try to bring the synthesis report plenary on board with respect to that. We're going to go through the 5 reasons for concern. Unique and threat systems sort of satisfies a number of the criteria. There's a paragraph there that sort of summarizes a major conclusion of the third assessment report. Here's a manifestation of that from a chapter on ecosystems, sort of thinking about species extinction at various levels of increase of global mean temperature above pre-industrial, and sort of displays it out relative to a couple of development scenarios. Out of this, you get the idea of accelerating vulnerability, accelerating risk along this reason for concern, and that the timing of it is contingent on the development pathway that might actually be the third assessment report had a huge debate about the degree to which observed impacts could be attributed to human interference. And Barton and I did a paper and sort of did a little thought exercise probabilistically to think about contours of the confidence level in the IPCC. The ecological community was sure that because they had almost 1,000 studies that showed a correlation between, potential correlation between climate change and observed impacts, and even though only 81% of those showed the correlation in the direction suggested by their understanding of the process, that they had very, very high confidence in the conclusion that they had seen the climate change. Well, we sort of thought about that and thought about the likelihood that there was a correct attribution of the observed impact to climate change, as there might be other sorts of things that and stresses that were causing the observed impacts. There might be publisher bias or researcher bias against publishing results that go in the wrong direction. There's certainly editor bias about publishing results that say we didn't find anything, and we didn't find anything is just as important as sort of taking the census of what we know as something else. So our DOT, assessing what we thought was reasonable judgments about all of those sorts of parameters, put it sort of right in the middle of the median confidence band. That was a huge argument in the third assessment report. By the time the fourth assessment report arrived, there were 21,000 observed impacts, scattered mostly over Europe, but lots and lots of places, and the evidence was much stronger, so high confidence is the conclusion that in fact we've seen that. Extreme weather events. The heat wave in Europe is demonstrated there, distribution of impacts, potential for adaptation, and so on and so forth. Here's a little distribution of summer temperature in that region of the world, and 2003 lives out there someplace. Before we get more excited about that, others of us sort of say, well, what we learned more than something about the relative likelihood is that even though Europe is a highly developed region and should have very high adaptive capacity to be able to respond to these sorts of stresses, tens of thousands of people die, and so they're not exercising particularly well that capacity to adapt. So while we may or may not want to talk about changes in the relative likelihood of the extreme weather, we can say that we now know more about vulnerability, consequence of these sorts of things that could be associated with climate, and therefore the risk is high. Katrina, we think, demonstrated the same thing within the United States. So there's the follows. The risk can be assessed to be previously higher than thought. even though sort of maybe with the association of coastal storm frequency and intensity, we're still not sure whether or not that association is strong, and sort of statements are going one way or the other. We have learned a lot about the relative consequences from the working group 2 social science perspective that allows us to say this is possible. Distributional impacts. These are the sorts of things that we think we know now with very high confidence, and so on. Some of them may produce a positive impact. Some seem to be modest but negative, but some have really large errors. Have to do with risks of malnutrition, increases in the number of people suffering from death, disease, and injuries from extreme weather events, changes in the range of extreme infectious disease sectors. The degree of confidence is indicated there. For my money as an economist, and it's a little bit hard to say, but I no longer think it's essential that we calibrate all of that stuff in dollars and cents or pounds or euros. That is perfectly appropriate to think about these things in metrics where they make the most sense. Maybe portray risk profiles of what those messages tell so that they become unitless, comparable metrics for assessing the trade-off in the negotiation political economy arena without trying to add it all up. Mega deltas were identified as particularly at risk, especially in Asia and Africa, in large measure because those are where a number of other external stresses tend to pile on. The question of where are the most vulnerable settlements and most vulnerable people on the planet was not a question that people could comfortably answer after the third assessment report. We think we probably can do a much better job after the fourth assessment report. And so this is Martin's sort of take on the slide with that. And in the bottom in the blue, in all countries, even those with high income, some are especially at risk, for the elderly, and there you go. Net aggregate impacts, this is the economic stuff. Here's a third assessment report graph that shows as a function of change in global mean temperature, percent of world GDP that would be affected one direction or the other by the associated estimated impacts of climate change. Some of them go down right away, some of them go up for a little bit and then down. All of them eventually turn negative except for Mendelssohn, who thinks we can adapt to just about anything. There's an awful lot of content buried behind those lines to the point where they may actually not be particularly revealing at all. But one of the reasons there's disparity is the influence of climate change on agricultural yields. CO2 fertilization on the one hand, with the availability of water, changes in pests and a variety of things like that. Models that get benefits from modest farming assume that productivity in agriculture goes up. We see here from these data, this is from Chapter 5 working group 2, that for the mid to high latitude maize, that may be true. For mid to high latitude wheat, that may be true, but in low latitudes, yields tend to fall almost immediately. If you ask me why they don't start at zero, I don't know. All of this filters into this graph, which is either extraordinarily confusing or a source of great comfort to people who want to tell one story or another, and to most economists these days are saying things like these aggregate numbers really don't tell you what you want to tell. These are distributions of estimates of the social cost of carbon, which is essentially the marginal cost of one increase of 1 ton of emissions of carbon at, I think, 2005. They're all over the place. 12% of them are negative. For very low discount rates, you can get 30% of them higher than $125 a ton. For high discount rates, $125 a ton is at about the 95th or 98th percentile of the published estimates. They are all over the place. This was published in Chapter 20, which is from Richard Cole. Richard Cole has a new one. The median is how do you go from one range to another? Well, down here, you have beneficial agriculture and energy savings in latitudes for modest temperature decreases. Very high discount rates, so the damages that occur later don't get weighed very much in the estimate of the marginal cost of carbon. And you don't weight equity distribution or implications at all. So it's just the dollars. How you get way out here is have a very low curated time preference, so you have a low discount rate. You weight equity in a way that says, at the very least, that the marginal utility of consumption declines as consumption goes up, so $8 worth of damage in personal consumption in a poor country is far more damaging than $1 worth of damage and reduction in personal consumption to somebody who lives in a rich country. You sort of weight the aggregate in that particular way. You can get way out there. One last insight is that Mother Nature can undo any of those decisions. Those are both decisions that policymakers and decision makers or people who want to impose their view of the world can make choices about. But changes in climate sensitivity could move you one side or the other. It's sort of, again, climate sensitivity to get you something negative. You can certainly get something really, really low or something really, really high. So this is another manifestation, I think, that the uncertainty is out there to such a great degree that this is not a sort of problem for which you can answer a question that cost-benefit analysis requires that you answer, that is the marginal cost of the carbon. Rather, you begin to think about what the risks are associated with it and what they're sensitive to with respect to what Mother Nature is going to tell us, and also with respect to what decision makers will tell us. That's what it is. Okay, here's the last one, large-scale irreversibilities. You may not recognize that picture. It's Greenland. It hasn't been published anywhere, so you try to look at that from an airplane on the way to Valencia. And the brown is, in fact, brown. Here is the hint of one of the objectives of the Working Group 2 perspective. We'll talk about it in a little bit, and it's formally with a great deal of criticism. But here's ranges of temperatures associated with different time slices. We did publish that in Working Group 2, even though Working Group 1 wasn't happy with it. Here's some stabilization runs from the tar, and here's some notion of the singular events, these continuities, when they might start to come online. So all of that came together. We can go back and talk about this, but the right-hand side is an updated version that some of us have put together of burning embers and the changes in colors. It is not something that accurately portrays information, but it certainly portrays impressions. It's designed to sort of therefore attract attention and get people to look behind what's going on in the colors. The soundbite interpretation of it is that the thresholds of going from yellow to orange to red are all lower than they were just 5 years ago. And that even for something like this, because of some concerns that there may be thresholds that we would cross in this century for relatively low temperature increases, that we commit ourselves to a large scale discontinuities well downstream, is actually yellow at a very low level. So, now we get to what I think is, because of all of that complication and uncertainty in the range of social costs and stuff, two fundamental conclusions out of Working Group 2. One is that adaptation is unavoidable because the planet is committed to more warming even if greenhouse gas emissions were halted today. That is important for the people who worry about whether decision makers are concerned, because it means that talking about adaptation is not giving up on the problem. For a very long time, the environmental community did not want to talk about adaptation because it sounded like, well, you're just going to try to respond to all of the symptoms, you're not going to treat the disease, and you just washing the hands of the problem as a whole. Even if mitigation were 100% effective tomorrow morning, we would be committed to almost another degree warming over the next century. There will be impacts associated with that, and adaptation will be required with respect to talking about adaptation is not giving up. Secondly, in blue in the italics is sort of my emphasis. This is plenary approved outline, meaning governments approved it word for word unanimously in the synthesis report. And it says responding to climate change involves an iterative risk management process that includes both adaptation and mitigation, and takes into account climate change damages, co-benefits, sustainability, equity, and attitudes towards risk. So the first business is they accept the notion of risk. The second business is that they accept the notion you have to do both adaptation and mitigation. Neither one alone is sufficient. The third is that it's somehow going to be an iterative process. They are not going to provide you 2008 climate policy for the whole century and sign a deal in Copenhagen. They will return to this over and over and over again. So a question becomes, how do you make those adjustments? How frequently will you monitor in the meantime? Something like that. I'm not sure we have answers to those particular questions. But it makes the conversation about what to do in the meantime a little bit easier. The long-term objective might be out there with respect to avoiding certain risks. What we do in the short term becomes a lot easier to talk about. And then the last bit, taking into account climate change damages, okay, both co-benefits, that's code for climate might be good. In some places, they should take advantage of that. It's also code for climate policy may actually produce benefits elsewhere. But then there's sustainability, equity, and attitudes towards risk. That puts these discussions squarely in the context of finance ministries and the places where people worry about such things and suggest that you can no longer think about climate in isolation, and that you should be able to get people who work in those ministries who worry about sustainability, who worry about equity issues, and have been confronting problems from a risk management perspective for 40 or 50 years, and therefore understand what it means to have an attitude and aversion to risk. Those sorts of things have to be taken into account. The science has to inform those discussions, and the next IPCC report has to. Here's Australia and New Zealand's chapter that really illustrates, or rather, picture for that, really illustrates the sort of mixing of adaptation and mitigation. There's sort of the notion that along with the range of metrics of impacts that we were worried about, there's a current coping range. This is sort of within natural variability within that particular area. So we can do okay, we can handle that. There's some adaptive capacity in those two countries that can expand the coping ranges, and we could try to help out with that. It's not evenly distributed across the various sectors, but it's there. But in each and every one of those, eventually, both the coping capacity and the capacity to adapt to the expand the coping capacity is overwhelmed by the climate change impact, and mitigation is required. Here's a working group 3 picture. I know Jay Edwin was here, probably talked about that. These are sort of different categories of mitigation. This is what sort of, to me, frames what might be the long-term objectives that allows you to sort of focus the conversation of what you do in the short, medium term about how you get off the dime and move towards what you might consider a long-term objective. And so, therefore, for me, this is perhaps the most critical column in the Working Group 3 report for the upcoming negotiations. At what point in the future or the past do we have to think about the peak of global emissions of things like CO2 equivalents, so that efficiently and economically with some degree of minimum cost or expectation of minimum cost, we can achieve certain objectives, certain categories of mitigation, certain concentration targets and CO2 equivalents, and therefore certain ranges of temperature that we are going to have to live with. So, finally talking a little bit about the future, and then opening it up for conversation. There are obviously specific research needs that come out of these assessments, and that's sort of speaking to the research community. It's pretty easy to do that. You have to need to think about context and priorities, And if there's no sort of overarching science plan, maybe it's not particularly efficient, but so be it. That's what science works, and that's the way science works. It's not the hard to do that. There is, I think, a tension between negotiators' need to have some updated information for Copenhagen and the IPCC's necessity to preserve the credibility of both its special reports and its comprehensive assessment. Just so we can't rush into this stuff and screw it up. The good name of the IPCC is questioned by some, but if we screw it up, then we'd be questioned by most. There is a little bit of tension between the working groups that, frankly, when we started to work together towards the end of this year, this report started to melt away in Estes Park and moving towards Valencia. And it would be good to sort of capitalize on that. This is where I'd like to end up, trying to speed the pace at which IPCC results are reflected in February approved outlines. It doesn't necessarily mean speeding up the pace of the assessments or having more of them. In fact, that ship is already done with doc. I think it's sort of 8 years from now. So in the end, it was going to be a fifth assessment report. But it strikes me that the process can learn from itself much more quickly and much more efficiently. I'm not going to read this, but this is Martin Perry's list of research priorities from a working group perspective. Some of it has to do with observed impact, some of it has to do with the correlation between development pathways and vulnerabilities and risks. Some of it has to do with what you might try to monitor to make adaptive decisions and policies as you think about things. A lot more about adaptation and what we know about adaptation, and an awful lot more about the integration between impact adaptation and sustainable development. This is me. It strikes me that that's an awful lot to do, that maybe, as people think about what research they want to get funded and do, the lens of key vulnerabilities and those criteria might actually be a useful thing to think about before we sort of go off and spend 2.5 years of your life on a particular topic. Make sure it sort of satisfies a number of those criteria to speak to a wider range of issues beyond the specific topic. Okay, here's the timing tension. The negotiators want information about risks now. So they understand that they're not just going to get high confidence conclusions. They might get some low to medium to modest confidence conclusions and potentialities if they're associated with very high consequences. There was even a call in Bali to have another assessment done within a month of the negotiations in Copenhagen, which is similar to prevailed, and that didn't happen. Not sure who would have done that. The IPCC itself wants to, as I said, preserve the integrity, and so this tension is actually of its own creation, or at least the framework's convention's creation. The IPCC is created to inform the negotiations of the framework convention, and it's set up with its own utility rules and its new process, but now there's sort of this urgency imposed. Okay, so what are the reactions to this tension? Susan Sullivan and Mark Manning wrote an editorial in Science a couple of weeks ago. They were in favor of periodic assessments, they were in favor of preserving the process, and they were emphatic that they should make sure that the science was getting right. Shortly after that, there was actually sort of a group of working group, 2 CLAs in Washington. We got together at the National Academy of Sciences. And they agreed with what Susan and Martin wrote, but they emphasized that there's a need to do the right science as well, and that's the sort of the last paragraph, or last couple of words in that conclusion that I highlighted before. There are decision makers who are worried about things like equity and sustainability and attitudes towards risk, and the right science will inform those decision makers where they are making decisions and doing their considerations. We might want to use the key criteria to prioritize, and we also came up with the notion that carefully crafted special reports in short order might make success. Martin and Susan were a little reluctant to suggest that we should do such things, working group 2 is not. Examples of detention. Let me give you 2 of them, providing information in critical timeframes, or sort of alluded to that, also providing information about the range of possible outcomes, perhaps based on observations, even if the understanding or the modeling, including its calibration, isn't exactly right. So 2 examples. This is from the Stern Review. This indicates a range of possible impacts for a variety of different calibrations. Here's temperature change ranges for equilibrium for different concentration targets. And sort of here is the risk-based story that Stern wanted to tell. Here I will own up to what Working Group 2 wanted to do. This is our version of that. This is a sectoral impacts table that did make it to the SPM. It's calibrated on particular increases in global mean temperature and talks about long-term commitment to sea level rise, millions of people at risk of flooding and storms, terrestrial biosphere trends towards net carbon source, widespread coral mortality, and a variety of things like that. And to be honest, what Working Group 2 would want to do would be to say, we would like to be able to talk within the century about the benefits calibrated across those impacts of moving along certain mitigation trajectories. And we'd also like to be able to say, what would we gain if we held temperatures below a certain particular level? So you could say, well, here's the 6% committed over the next century that we can't do anything about. So here's the adaptation that's absolutely necessary. Here is a 2 degrees of pre-industrial target that the European Union is fond of. And so these are continuing impacts that adaptation, for which adaptation is going to be required. Here are some risks that you could avoid by achieving that. And what, in fact, we'd like to be able to do is to say, well, if you talk about 5 degrees or 4 degrees or 3 degrees or 2 degrees or whatever, this is sort of what's buying you as you move down that. And we'd like to be able to say in 2050, if the range of possibilities is 2 degrees to 4 degrees, this is what we could buy you within that time frame. Now, the problems with that are, there's some natural science stuff about being able to do the calibrations within the century. Also, a large number of these impacts depend on at least 2 things that aren't reflected in the graph. One is the rate of change temperature, and one is the underlying socioeconomic development pathways, and the associated adaptive capacity. So that sort of exercise that I just sort of tried to articulate is not particularly well founded. It's illustrative and suggestive, and a lot of people sort of want to do it, but I finally got it that really can't do that with straight face. But, so I'll admit to that. I want to talk about this, though. I want to think about people who do adaptation, decision makers, information that they need, where they live, and where they're making work. These are some sea level rise trajectories for high and low emissions, A1 and D2, for how they manifest along the coast of the northeastern part of the United States. Sort of extrapolation of historical trends. This was actually published by Union of Concerned Scientists. This is something that they wanted to do, so it's in inches, not centimeters and things. So it's half a foot, almost a foot, a little bit more than a foot. That's from Fourth Assessment Report assessments of sea level rise. It's my understanding that Working Group 1 had trouble figuring out what's going on with the melting of the ice sheets and the contributions that were made from there. That the models weren't particularly good at describing those. And so the reported numbers for sea level rise, while there is a sort of caveat that says this doesn't include contributions from ice sheets and so on and so forth, it's essentially thermal expansion. Okay, so, and that's the range you get with thermal expansion. Post AR4, Lomsdorff did a statistical analysis of historical trends that includes obviously those contributions and irrespective of sort of imprecise process knowledge of what's going on, gets a number that's much higher. Now the deal is that if you are thinking in the Office of Sustainability for Mayor Bloomberg in New York City, and you want to think about when you might want to start worrying about flooding from coastal storms and sea surges and things like that, you probably want to take into account the notion that there is some contribution from the Greenland ice sheet and other ice sheet melting as you begin to make those conversations. Here is the current FEMA picture of the 100-year flood anomaly for New York City. The really good line about that is the Bronx may still be up, but that may still be down. And people are not riding in a hole in the ground because it's flooded. Here's an association with the return time of the current 100-year flood relative to sea level rise. And here are risk profiles categorized from really old numbers and relative likelihoods, climate sensitivities, and emissions trajectories that I did in the late 1990s. So that was the numbers, but the dimension and the timing of them, I think, is suggestive. These sort of are portraits of risk, cumulative probability distributions from 2025 to 2050, sort of indicating the relative likelihood that the 100-year flooding anomaly would end up looking like and recurring, say, every 25 years or every 40 years or every 10 years or something like that. It strikes me, and these are preliminary numbers suggestive of the way I want to portray this, that a decision maker in New York City thinking about planning for protecting infrastructure and things like that might want to look at those time frames, might want to assess his or her personal comfort about the relative risks of the flooding event and the anomaly. Think about when, therefore, they might want to have the protection in place. Think about how long it might take to build that protection back up from there, and begin to get an idea when you have to start doing this. You need to start putting money away. I know the mayor is rich, but he's leaving office pretty soon, so we probably raise money with him. So I might want to start thinking about such things like that. If you do not include the contributions from any reflection of the contributions from the ice sheet melting, you get an entirely different answer to when you should start thinking about this than if you do. I understand there's a degree of discomfort with respect to that, but people who are making decisions on the adaptation side need whatever you got for them, and that's like the story. Maybe the new scenarios will help with the inner century time frames. There's a great deal of discussion about how they're being created. There will be 4 of them. There's sort of party that they're ready to forcing. There will be significant scaling through 2035 on them, but they will go through 2200. They will be created in the middle and move backwards and forwards. Think about what the impacts would be in the findings of those in the context of socioeconomic development. That would move backwards to think about the degree to which they associate economically feasible in terms of getting there. For example, if you only get to 2.6 or 2.9 miles per meter squared, you have to start tramping on the brake really hard and really fast. What does that mean for the developing country? What does that mean for India? What does that mean for China? What does that mean for the distribution? There's such a thing as bad climate policy, just as dangerous climate policy, just as dangerous climate change. So speeding the pace, strikes me that those scenarios won't be ready for AR5, they certainly won't be ready for Copenhagen, that if we could set up a series and a mechanism by which we critically review what we've done and think about what we've learned, what it means, what it would have meant, that those sorts of self-critiques might be particularly informative, and informative in the creation of not only where the new science is going, but also what the preliminary outlines might look like. To be specific, working group 2 types think that we need a good deal more information about the practice of adaptation and mitigation. There's an enormous amount of practical knowledge out there. There are actually some people that have tried to mitigate, there's some people that have tried to adapt. They've studied themselves, they've written it down. It's not in the literature. Nobody's sort of assessed it, nobody's written it down, nobody's looked for common threads or common understandings. When it comes to running an assessment report for the IPCC, we can't talk about that stuff. It's not even in the grade literature. So we need to figure out how to get that out there. I'll tell you sort of the story, sort of the risk management perspective. There's a recent paper in the snowmass collection that was published last year that are essentially saying risk management is something that finance ministries do all the time. If you talk about this problem in those terms, you can gain access to the finance ministry. That happened in Costa Rica in 1965. But nobody wrote it down and nobody learned that lesson. So it took a lot of scratching the heads, and that's 40 years we could have actually used. The two-way connection between sustainable development and climate change, both positive and negative, needs to be more fully explored. We did our best, but there's a whole development community out there that doesn't know anything about climate change, and it's very difficult to engage them. But what if we did? What if we got them involved in a critical review of what we wrote in Chapter 20 and find out what we missed? And maybe ask the question, what would it look like if we had them involved in it? And then evaluation stuff. There's huge missing variables in any sort of aggregate metric. I'd like to hold a special meeting and see whether or not aggregation is actually worth the effort. The suggested structure that I would think about is that we start with a meeting to critically review the AR4, maybe the TAR, from new perspectives, invite people from all over the place who might have something to do with a topic that's near, even if they don't know anything about climate, and get them to spend some time answering the question, how would the chapter have changed if those perspectives had been available to the audience? Then maybe a smaller writing team could actually do it again. On the basis of this new information and the basis of what literature was available and what literature is really available, try to rewrite the chapter and add some maybe new stuff for negotiators if there's some new stuff for the assessment and the contribution of the assessment. And that these reports should close with suggestions and perhaps drafts of the synthetic chapters, what they should look like, what plenary approved outlines might look like for the adaptation chapter, the adaptation mitigation chapter, the sustainable development chapter, and maybe even some templates for what sort of topics should be covered in each of the sectoral chapters, in each of the country chapters. And the notion there is if you do that quickly enough, then that can get funneled into the process by which the outlines are approved, and that leapfrogs maybe 5 or 6 years of knowledge that we gain that otherwise would be included in the fifth assessment. So that's about all I want to do. I'll close with haiku version of the synthesis report that was created in one of our meetings at a time of particular chaos. Actually, there's a version that links us to all of the 5 different topics. Climate is changing, humans are to blame, people will suffer, which will try to cope. There are restrictions in the numbers of words. Pachi actually substituted a sentence for the last one that I keep in a very safe place in my house, and every time I need something for Pachi, I remind me that I have his handwriting saying exactly what he said. It has something to do with the ritual. So anyway, thank you very much, and I'd love to have a conversation and questions or just engage in discussion about trying to accelerate the process by which what we learn actually gets portrayed in the steps of this IPCC. Thank you.
At one point in your talk, you listed the discount rates as being critical in decision making. Are these discount rates exactly the same thing that you can get out of the behavior, say, major corporations? And if you do that, do you find that the discount rates that corporations use are dramatically higher than the 0 to 3% range that
Sure. I mean, corporations use discount rates that are sort of calibrated to their time frames, and they hardly ever look 100 years back and do things like that. But there are people who do that. Now, the discount rate, appropriate discount rate approach is sort of dictated by what Ramsey did in 1928. So there's a pure rate of time preference, and then there's a reflection of the marginal elasticity, marginal utility of consumption, and rate of growth. The elasticity business is a reflection of aversion to risk, and they both play a role in discounting. And in fact, the aversion to risk also plays a role in how you do the equity weighting of the impact. So it actually plays two of those. So there's two ways of going about this. One is to say, well, I think the discount rate should be less than so because corporations do it. And then you tend to have periods of time preference of around 3%, actual discount rates in real terms of 4.5–5%. The Copenhagen consensus process that Bjorn Romberg does, he insists on that, but at least it's not 20% like Reagan used to claim. You might hear on the opposite side people like Sir Nicholas Stern saying there is an ethical reason that we should not impose current generations of patients on decisions that affect future generations. And therefore the pure rate of time preference should be as close to 0 as the mathematics will allow. And so they use 0.01% as a pure rate of time preference. And so their sort of cost of carbon is $305. But if you use the other ones, you can get a median of 12 or 15 or something. Now, the last bit of your question, though, is actually something that Richard Toll and I started to fill. He can run a fund lots and lots of times and generate lots and lots of his integrated assessment model, lots of different uncertainty and can include climate sensitivities and a variety of things like that. But what he's done is found some literature that surveys attitudes towards risks and attitudes towards periods of time preference for decision makers in public institutions around the world. And the range that they have, and it sort of creates a bivariate distribution, it sort of runs a little bit below 1 to a little bit above 3 for both. And if you sample across that and look at the median, you can actually get, because of the really powerful double role of the risk aversion parameter, you can actually get a median estimate of the social cost of carbon that's well above $200 a ton. And so, again, we think Stern is right for the wrong reason. That's a very long answer.
Recommendation you made about getting more corporate framework, mitigation, and adaptation. I agree that would be very useful. But if adaptation and potential impact we're going to put in a risk-based approach and mitigation, framework will remain on the cost of carbon measuring. How do you see that coming?
Actually, the working group 3 guys are also thinking in terms of risk. And the language about the iterative risk management approach to mitigation and adaptation actually comes from working group 3. The way they get to risk is because their investments in mitigation, public funds in mitigation, don't generate absolute outcomes. They generate changes in the distributions of temperature, therefore changes in the distribution of index. So they approach discussions. They can approach discussions about how to do mitigation in terms of hedging strategies and insurance premiums and risk premiums associated with changing the probability distributions of the impacts. So it's not as far apart as you might say. That said, it strikes me that near-term to medium-term discussions about mitigation options can easily turn in terms of cost effectiveness. We need to think about moving toward peak emissions in 15 years. How do you affect that? And you're stuck with the ledges and the carbon sequestration. You can say, okay, $100 a ton is what we need to make it economically viable for massive carbon sequestration projects to come along. How long does it take to get those things online? Well, it takes a while to build them, or whether we have to get to $100 a ton in 2009. No, probably not. Maybe we should get there in 2020. So how do you do that? The cost minimizing way of achieving any concentration target into first approximation is set a scarcity rent, let it go up with the rate of interest, and add that to the price of fossil fuel as a reflection of its carbon content. So you could probably start at $50 a ton in 2010, get to $100 a ton in 2020, set up the appropriate cost-benefit analysis, investment decisions with people who are taking the private money into carbon capture and sequestration, it would be profitable for them to do, but you're not stopping on the economy in 2010 with $100 a ton problem. Yeah.
I want to turn to your two pieces as the economic impact assessor. You were the first people that did a lot of that work. And I think it's fair to say that the graph you showed with the mean price at around $25 a ton or $7 a ton for CO2 is something that's caused a lot of consternation. Beyond the board champions it in his book, Coolant, more than anything else. People really sort of bring that home because it's a recipe for not doing a whole lot in the near term. Now, you indicated that you guys are now looking at something that sounds almost like an inverse model. What do people do? All right, when there are public policy decisions made, and how do you infer, and you infer from that some time of a lower rate of pure time discounting. But it seems to me that inverse modeling could, in fact, be applied to the problem as a whole. There are all kinds of things that people do about climate change that are very, very difficult to quantify and that are absent in a lot of these models. There are asymmetries of gains and losses that people build into their behavior that are poorly understood. And it seems to me that it looks like, perhaps, that the world is moving towards some sort of action. Suppose the U.S. passes Lieberman Warner. That is inconceivable based on the median integrated assessment. So is it possible maybe to look at what people are actually doing about climate and do an inverse model to figure out really how they must be making decisions? And might that not go to more than just the rate of pure time distinction?
I think that'd be a great idea, and sure, it would go to much more than just their assessment of the period of time reference. It would go to the fundamental values with which they approach the problem. But we're not imposing it upon the rest of the world. We are inferring from their behavior that this is how they make those assessments.
How do you respond to the criticism that the body of literature that has been given birth to today has arguably made the problem a lot worse by many things that you know really ought to be in there?
I don't actually. I've criticized Stern because I thought it was a source of climate risk because it was so incredible that the focus of the conversation would be on all sorts of people would be on the numbers and not on the message. I have spoken about the inability of economic metrics to even if we had studied everything, to capture it quantitatively, that we need multiple metrics and concerns with respect to that. And then there's that, which is sort of an indication of the market to non-market to socially contingent impacts, what we've studied, and sort of sources of uncertainty, projection uncertainties, bounded risks, crossing thresholds, we know something about, and then sudden surprises. We have nothing on the lower right-hand side in the right-hand column. So now your question is, I think, what do you do about that? Well, we do know some of these things. And while I said this was dangerous, let me suggest what might be an appropriate thing to think about. There's calibrations of lots of things, calibrated temperature change rates, temperature change or whatever. Take something up there that you really don't like, that you really would not like to see happen. Associate that with an increase in global mean temperature. You you're going to do this seriously, go back and read some stuff, find out the degree to which is really associated with that, what adaptation might be doing, or make some maybe modification about what you think is a good temperature target to think about over the very long term. Then begin to work backwards and translate that into concentration targets that give you some degree of sense of the relative likelihood of staying under this temperature target which is high. And if you think it's 550 parts per million and you look for, if there's still 50% chance I'm over this threshold I don't like, maybe I should shoot for 450 parts per million, things like that. Then I think this story, this story helps. I've just told myself a story today that I want to be here. Not because it's going to guarantee me a temperature target, but because given current basis of information, there will be an X% chance that we will keep it under that. Okay, that tells me that that's my long-term objective. I'm going to keep track of that. In the short term, I have to think about peaking emissions somehow between now and 2020. And so I have to begin now to think about, in the economic short-term context where discounting isn't much of a problem as it is in the long-term, but negotiations are, and participation across the world is, and things like that. How do we get emissions to peak within that particular time frame? What do I have to do? Where do I have to start? And the answer might be equilibrium in water, but it probably isn't. It probably, may say it's $15 a ton of CO2, $50 a ton. Okay, that gives me a context. If I know that it's predictably and persistently going to go up at the rate of interest, then that sets up the incentives. Because it's really the rate of change of the price of carbon that provides some of the traction, and not so much where it starts. But I agree with you, Rob, that it's got to start a lot higher than 7, especially if it's not global participation. Yes?
Yeah. The other day I was reading the newspaper and said that the emission of CO2 from Germany, one country, one emission, is sending out 10-year increase of emission by China alone. So this tells you how rapid these two developing countries, China and India, their emission will increase. And considering that, it seems to me, it's almost a foregone conclusion. No matter what we do, large global warming and its impact will occur. And therefore, in my opinion, that future IPCC report should put much more emphasis in discussing adaptation. Because people are talking about, because if you emphasize adaptation, people stop thinking about mitigation. But that doesn't seem to be a very good excuse not to think about seriously about adaptation. And what do you think about it?
I couldn't agree with you more. That's why I sort of emphasize that as one of what I think are the fundamental conclusions, really important, significant conclusions from the fourth assessment report. And I cast it in the context of if mitigation were 100% successful overnight, we would still have to do some adaptation. So talking about adaptation is not giving up. The first special report process that I would favor would be one on adaptation. And its integration with mitigation, and how it's practiced, what decisions are made, who's thinking about it. Two other stories. I mean, the state of Connecticut yesterday, the second body of the legislature, it's on the governor's desk, passed a climate change bill that had emissions targets for 2020 and 2050. To me, they are far less important than articles that would require the governor to create a sub-cabinet level on adaptation to climate impacts across the state of Connecticut within the public sector and to inform the private sector. And that those would report to the governor and the legislature on an annual means that those people, in terms of what people are, how people are behaving, that message has gotten through to them. The story that you told at the beginning is so close to, geez, there's nothing we can do because there's going to be such enormous growth in the developing countries, so give up. That it's a little bit troublesome, but some of the people that work in the Energy Modeling Forum have access to some of the people who confer with decision makers at the top levels around the world. One of them is somebody who meets with the planning people in the People's Republic of China. And we have been told that they have on the shelf a program by which they would try to commit themselves to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 25% in the next 15 years. And the only thing that is required to trigger their enacting that is the United States signs on to emissions reductions.